Hello, everyone. Today we're going to look at some of the basic elements of a short story. Well, many of the elements we look at today, most of you will know, you'll have studied, you'll know the basic definitions, but it's still important to make sure that we all have the same language to use when we're examining text this semester. So today we'll discuss definitions and basic elements of short stories, and then we'll touch on the biography of Woody Allen, the author of our first story. And then after this video, you can begin reading his story, The Kugelmass Episode. So first, what is a short story? A short story is a work of fictional narrative prose with a few characters, limited setting, and a single main event. But it's important to know that this definition is not perfect. For every definition that there's been of a short story, there's usually an exception. So you will occasionally find a short story like Happy Endings by Margaret Atwood that has more than just a few characters. You'll find some short stories that have a more expansive setting or more than one single main event. But this is a general definition, and those exceptions can be true if they fit a lot of the definition, but not all of it. So first, some of the very basics that we need to know about are setting, the time and place of a story. When people think setting, they usually think of place, but it's always important to note that it's the time as well, when it occurred. It's in a short story, the setting is usually limited to important details. Novels can spend entire chapters describing a castle. A short story might focus on one or two elements like stale air or pale red rugs that are often attempting to convey meaning to the reader. So if you have a story that has a castle, first you should think about, this is a short story. The reason they chose this castle is probably important. And what does a castle symbolize? Castle symbolizes wealth. It symbolizes power. It symbolizes perhaps like a kingdom, right? Or and it's also usually out of history. It's usually not something that is still actively used, or at least not in the same way it once was. Now, stale air and pale red rugs, right? If we get details like that in a short story, we want to think, well, what could this be indicating? What could the author be trying to convey with this? And it could be that power, that majesty has become old and stale and worn out. And so we could learn a lot about a story by thinking about that and thinking, this is going to be a story about changing power or power that has disappeared. So another reason to pay attention for setting in a short story is that it establishes the mood. You can definitely get a foreboding mood here, an idea that it's heavy, that something creepy might happen. Or that it foreshadows later events, that gives a hint at what yet to come. You could very easily picture a story with these details leading up to a murder or a ghost story or something like that. Let's look at an example of this from a text that we'll look at towards the end of the semester. I will wait for, it's Alice Walker's Everyday Use. I will wait for her in the yard that Maggie and I made so clean and wavy yesterday afternoon. A yard like this is more comfortable than most people know. It is not just a yard, it's an extended living room. When the hard clay is swept clean as a floor with fine sand around the edges, lined with tiny irregular grooves, anyone can come and sit and look up into the elm tree and wait for the breezes that never come inside the house. So as I was reading that, what kind of mood does it convey? What details jump out to you? What can we learn about the characters mentioned? What should we expect from the story when we see a setting like this? So what I do when I'm trying to figure out this is I pretend I'm a detective, and I need to search for clues embedded in the story. So I often highlight what I feel are important terms, or terms that indicate something. And so I highlight it clean and wavy. That's not something you normally think of with a yard, but so it kind of stands out. And that a yard like this is more comfortable than most people know. So comfort, that this person feels comfortable outdoors, and makes it her own. It's like an extended living room. So a person who feels at home in nature. Hard clay is swept clean as a floor with fine sand around the edges and lined in irregular grooves. So this is an interesting detail in that, yes, she feels comfortable in nature, but she also controls the natural setting. And so she feels as if she's at home there, but she wants to make it her own. And so we learn a lot about the narrator from that. And finally, it ends with breezes that never come inside the house, so that you can feel that from the outside. And a breeze represents coolness, relaxation, comfort, ease. And so we have a character who is strong, comfortable in nature, controls nature, and a hint that she's at ease. So other details to watch for in the setting. If there's more than one time or place in a story, try to determine why the author chose to juxtapose the different times and places. So you're going to see this in the Kugelmass episode, our first story. One setting is in New York City, and the other's in France. And why does the author choose those two settings? How do they compare? How do they contrast? Why might the author want to present that compare and contrast to the reader? We can learn a lot about that. Does the setting impact the mood? We talked about that with the castle example. Do the characters act differently in different settings? If you have the main character of everyday use comfortable and strong in nature, and then they end up in a meeting with top executives, and the main character seems feeble and nervous and anxious. What can you learn about the character from how they act differently in those settings? Or is there a pattern in the settings presented? Similarly, that can be connected with, do they act differently in different settings? But after all that, so you need to examine every setting. You need to try to figure out how it connects. But after all that, sometimes a scene is just a scene. And so sometimes the author didn't mean all that we interpret out of it. And that's okay. For example, I once studied a poet for a few years, and then she came to speak at the school I was at that time. And I was all excited to ask her some questions about things I had gotten from her work. And so at dinner, I talked with her, and I was like, "Oh, I've been dying to ask you this. I noticed that on nearly every page of your poetry, there's water imagery or symbols or some mention or relation to water. And I want to know what you meant by that. What purpose did it serve?" And she looked at me, and she hesitated, and she finally said, "That's so interesting. I never noticed that I did that. But my husband works with water systems, so perhaps it was just on my unconscious mind." So I was blown away. I was like, so I studied this for years, and she didn't even know she was doing it. But years later, as I learned more about literature and studying literature, there are a couple of things there. First of all, whether she meant it or not doesn't really matter. Our interpretation is separate from what the author's intention was. We can get a lot out of a story that the author didn't intend. It can teach us about our culture, about our world, about ourselves, about anything. Second, what I found out years later is authors often lie. And that sounds weird, but there's this artistic idea that they want the reader to determine the meaning. They don't want to give the meaning to the reader. And so often when authors are asked straight out about meanings of text, they'll either avoid it or lie. So our interpretation is just as important as author's intent. Okay, so some other basic definitions. We have plot. It's a sequence of event that has a beginning, middle, and end. But again, there's always exceptions to this rule. Or you have to look at it a different way to see the beginning, middle, and end. Margaret Atwood's Happy Endings is just a perfect example for exceptions all the time, because that short story, which we may look at, I'm not sure if we'll get there by the end of the term, but it has many endings and beginnings and endings. And so it just flies in the face of the definition, yet it's widely considered to be a short story. Character, the people the story is about. On rare occasions, it can be an animal or object that's personified. And so when we see the characters in a story, again, in a short story, the space is so limited. The author's trying to get a lot across in very little space. So you want to think why they presented this character. What meaning does it have that this character was comfortable in nature and a strong person, and why might that be something they want to get across? Then theme. So theme is the underlying or stated main idea of the story. Now, traditional stories, like we'll look at one early in the semester, The Allegory of the Cave, or fables or parables, or other types of didactic literature, meaning literature that is meant to educate or instruct, make their purposes clear by explicitly stating a moral or interpretation at the end of the story. But short stories are much more subtle and nuanced. We can get meaning, we can try to figure out a moral, right? But the author rarely gives it to you. And most of the time, there's many different meanings and morals and things you can pull from this main ideas you could pull from the story. So we have to understand that, be comfortable with that there's no one right perfect answer, and still try to understand. Try to understand what the author might have been thinking. Try to understand how we interpret it. So as far as theme, there's no correct answer to the main theme of a story, just as I said with moral. Even when the author insists that there is, like I said with water, same idea. It's a matter of interpretation, but some interpretations are more likely or more widely accepted. So when you're writing this semester, your assignments, yes, you can interpret literature in any way you want, as long as you have evidence. Okay, so you need to be able to prove your point with evidence from the story. As long as you can do that, any interpretation you have is valid, as long as you have that evidence. So now there's many ways to show a theme in a story. Some are explicit, some are more implicit or hidden. One example of this is James Joyce. He's a master of hidden themes. And so one of his books, Ulysses, is most lists one of the top books of the 20th century. And what it does is it has a story that you could read and not study too much. Or you could study each chapter of this story. You could spend years studying it to get all of the hidden themes and meanings out of it. So for instance, each chapter has a musical theme. Each chapter has a philosophical theme. Each chapter has a religious theme of some sort. And just to give one silly example of this is one of his chapters was all about all kinds of symbol and imagery of Christianity. And so he's given all this imagery of Christianity, and it seems like in this chapter he's saying, oh, Christianity is the answer to everything, and if we all just become Christians, our lives will be better. And then he ends the chapter with a horse. And as you're watching the horse takes a dump. And it drops 3 turds. And so basically, he set up the reader for that whole chapter, and at the end says, all that I just told you, it's a load of horse crap. And so some themes, again, are explicit, and some are much more implicit, like that one I just explained with James Joyce. As you're reading the Kugelmass episode, what I want you to look for are things like irony. Irony is the use of words to convey a meaning that is the opposite of its literal meaning. The irony of her reply, how nice, when I said I had to work all weekend. So irony and sarcasm are very close, right? We often say stuff like this. So how would you like if I gave you a 50-page paper and you could say something like, that would be amazing. You're the best professor ever. And we know that you really mean the opposite of it. But it's also, in a story, irony works on more than just that surface level. So how does the character plot development seem to be the opposite of what's actually stated? So you could have a mad scientist who's just absolutely brilliant, but forgets his car keys all the time. That could be an ironic element. Or you could have this amazing, incredible supermodel, and then no one's attracted to her. Something like that, the opposite of what's expected. And what you want to think is, why does the author use irony here? What could he be trying to convey? He with Woody Allen, the author of our first story. Another thing you want to look for is intertextuality. This is when a book refers to a second book by title, scene, character, storyline. When a book refers to a social text, such as media, social, or cultural story. So anytime you're reading a short story, again, where there's limited space, so every word has meaning. Anytime they reference something like a movie, a magazine, a book, anything at all, you want to ask why. Why are they using this? And you'll see this in the Kugelmass episode. And so when you're reading the Kugelmass episode, I want you to underline or circle or highlight any other texts loosely, the term text loosely, that he refers to. And what I want you to do is just Google those texts. And I don't want you to spend a lot of time on it, but just skim a little bit to find out what's that text about. And try to come up with an answer of why he might be using that intertextuality in that way. I also want you to look for foreshadowing. I mentioned this before, that it's an advance hint as to what's to come later in the story. With the castle example, we thought, the castle, the pale red rugs and the stale air. It might indicate a fading power. And if there's a character that has power in this story, you might think, oh boy, this person's probably going to lose this power at some point. Well, okay, so let's move on to a little bit about Woody Allen as you go into reading the Kugelmass episode. He worked as a comedy writer in the 50s, writing jokes and scripts for television and publishing books. And then in the 60s, he began performing as a stand-up comedian, emphasizing monologues rather than traditional jokes. So while there's always been an element of monologue in humor, he really helped to popularize it. And so when you watch like a late night TV show or a lot of stand-up comedians who tell stories, that's really what Woody Allen popularized. He was one of the fathers of that type of monologue. By the 60s, he was writing and directing films. He's over at least 40 films, I believe probably closer to 50 at this point. Many of them have been nominated for Academy Awards. He's won 4. One of his best is called Annie Hall. And he has more screenwriting Academy Award nominations than any other writers. Okay, so what I want you to do is read the Kugelmass episode. Before you start reading, I want you to read the questions first, so you know what to look for as you're reading. And actually, before you start that, I want you to just take the quiz. It's just a short quiz, just to make sure that you listen to this. Thanks. I'll see you guys soon.